So the text that we have today, all of them are familiar, which is not usually the case. I'm going to get to John in a minute, but I have trouble with John because I feel like you can read him for hours at a time, and he's just so circular. It's I abide in you, you abide in them, they abide in so-and-so, and it's just, you get 5 chapters just like that, and it's like, wow, what is happening here? And I would love to tell you that I'll give you about 8 minutes here and it's all going to be sewn up. But the answer is it's been 2,000 years and it's not all sewn up. So we'll give you some things to kind of chew on for the week as you move through the days of this week and of this season. We are now well into the second half of this week of weeks, as we say, the week of weeks that we celebrate Easter. 49 days, bringing us to the 50th day, which we know as Pentecost, as we move towards that on the 19th of May coming up. Also this year known as Confirmation Sunday. So a lot of things going on as we move towards that. I want to start with the first reading, though. As we mentioned last week, the first reading often is from the Old Testament, but during this season of Easter, it's often from the New Testament, from the book of Acts. And we get a powerful story here that is fascinating to me because it's probably one of the best examples of how when a reading comes up for a given Sunday, it sits with you differently, depending on where you are in your own life, where we are as a community, the news of the world. All of these things cause a reading to land on our ears and on our hearts in different ways. And this one really lends itself to that. In this story, we hear after the resurrection, after the ascension, that Philip essentially has a dream, a vision, that he is called to go somewhere so that he might teach someone about Jesus. And an important part of the story that's just kind of a throwaway in here is that Philip goes, drops what he's doing, and goes. Sometimes I think we feel a little pulled on our heart perhaps to do something. We pull out our phone and say, yeah, Jesus, that's not happening today. The calendar's kind of full. So, maybe next week, catch me up. But rather, Philip drops what he's doing and he goes. And then we get this curious story. He doesn't bump into somebody. He bumps into the treasurer of the Queen of Ethiopia. Like you do. He happened to be in town at the temple. He had been reading from the Jewish prophets, and he was there. But because of his official position and his background, he also was not a regular person just because he was this high official, but he was also a eunuch. That was something that put you forever on the outside. In those high government places, there was a sense of safety in this, but also it set him apart in a way that would not allow him to worship in Jerusalem like everyone else. He was, and I'll use the word because it shows up later in the reading, he was prevented from being in the center of the worship life because of who he was. Now, it's interesting, it's not, in my mind, the main part of today's sermon, but stories can be different kinds of stories, right? If we watch a movie, depending on whether you put the scary music under it or the happy music, suddenly the story is kind of a different story, right? This story could have been a story of healing. Philip could have shown up and seen this man and restored him. It's not a healing story, though. I find that interesting. The other part of this story that touches with news that I think that is maybe not central to our text today, but you'll notice that Jerusalem, that we always hear about, Philip goes to meet this man on the road to Gaza. Yes, that Gaza. It's been around for a while. he goes out to this road. And what's interesting to me about the text, particularly as I was just hearing it as we were reading it, is that it says that it is a wilderness road, which is interesting. To our modern ears, we might hear wilderness and think, oh, must be beautiful, right? Good views, nature. That's not wilderness road. Wilderness road is, do I have my bear spray? Wilderness is scary. And it's difficult to read a text like this today and not think of the roads that lead to Gaza today, right? A wilderness, a difficult, a painful place in this time as we reflect on it. As Philip approaches and speaks with this court official, the court official is reading from the prophets, and Philip is picture him kind of jogging along the side of the chariot, right? Hey, I can tell you about that. And he begins to speak to him. And the court official is very interested in this. He teaches him about Jesus and how he is spoken of in the prophets. And as they pass by water, the official says something that is probably in my mind, one of the biggest questions in all of the New Testament. He says, look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized? What is to prevent me from being baptized? This is a huge question because he has just come from Jerusalem, which I didn't look this up on a map, but if you're on foot, even in a chariot, is not handy to Ethiopia, right? So he has traveled a huge distance to worship in the temple where he likely was prevented because of who he was from participating like others might participate in the worship and ritual life of the temple. And so he says, what is to prevent me from being baptized? Now, as I'm imagining this scene going through, I'm picturing Philip kind of getting this dead-eye look right after the question, right? Like, the answer to the question is nothing. Nothing. Not who you are physically, not your, at the risk of a modern overlay, perhaps gender, identity, not the fact that you are from another nation, not the fact that you aren't Jewish, not any fact that might have precluded your ability to participate in the temple life in Jerusalem. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. The answer is nothing. And he was baptized at that place and in that moment. There is a power in this Acts story that I think is sometimes overlooked in Christian communities. One last piece I would say about that text specifically is it's not just that Philip is a cool guy, happened to be in the right place at the right time, didn't prevent him from being baptized because he was a eunuch or he was foreign or whatever the case might be. But the added overlay to this is that if you recall how the story starts, Jesus personally commanded Philip to go to this man. That, I think, is an important first step of this story. So now that this man is baptized and returning to Ethiopia, prepared perhaps to share the story, what is this story? And I think that brings us into the second reading and the gospel text. This idea that God is love. God is not one to set up boundaries and to keep people separated from one another, to prevent others from coming near and experiencing the love of God. No, but rather this love of God is like that soda that you filled up too quickly and goes all over the kitchen counter. It goes everywhere, everywhere, in spite of our instinctive desire to keep it penned in at times. That is not the love of God. It spills messily everywhere, even where we'd rather it didn't go. Those places too. You'll notice in the first letter of John, that was our second reading today, and in the gospel text from John, we get this word abide, right? It's this curious, somewhat regular English word that is at the same time super churchy. It's kind of a weird thing, particularly in evangelical circles. You'll hear this word abide. Jesus abides in us, we abide in Jesus. And it comes from this passage among others. But I was looking into the Greek on this text. Meno is the word for abide. And it has a couple of different meanings that I think are very powerful. It has the basic meaning like we would understand it in basic English, to live in, right? This is the home in which I abide. Super awkward way to say it, but we would understand what that meant. This is where I live, right? This is where I live. But the word means to stay, to remain. It also means to keep faith, to be loyal to remain steadfast. These are all ways in which this word gets used in the New Testament. When we think of the image here of the grapevine and the branches, right? There's a real kind of visceral understanding of what it means to abide, to be the branches that are loyal and remain with and live in the vine, and the vine that is loyal to and steadfast in relationship to the branches. And then we get an image of pruning, we often have good ideas about how somebody else ought to be pruned, right? And maybe not so much about how we need to be pruned so that we might bear fruit, right? I was looking at this, and occasionally I will invite Pastor Friederike to watch a short video clip. There is a scene in the James Bond movie Skyfall. It's a court scene, and Judi Dench, who plays M, quotes from Tennyson, from Ulysses. And it talks about how age has perhaps caused us to wither or fail, but that the spirit is strong, that we might not yield. That in some ways has this abide kind of feel to it. I think as we put all of these readings together and move through this week, particularly in this season of Easter, we are mindful of the love of God that is God's primary character, primary characteristic, a love that spills out in the world that cannot be prevented, even when in our gut maybe we feel like it should be. God does not limit that love in the way in which we might. What is to prevent me from being baptized? And then in the gospel text, we are mindful that our lives together, our lives grafted to the vine, lives that are pruned for the purpose of bearing fruit in this world, that we might engage and interact with this world in a way that makes the world better, the lives of many better, but perhaps more intimately and importantly, the lives of those closest to us better. So as you go through this week, think of those words. What is to prevent the love of God? How do we abide in Christ as the vine? How do we embody as fruit of our lives the love of God? to those around us. Amen.